In the final days of September 1878, in a remote valley where the frost killed men in their sleep, most homesteaders stacked firewood and sealed their cabins against the coming winter. But Jonathan Decker was doing none of that. Day after day, he hauled shattered stone from an ancient landslide, cutting 40 steps downward through the broken slope, chasing a ribbon of warm air that no one else could feel. Settlers called it a suicide, a staircase into a collapsed mountain. They said the ice would seal him inside forever. But Jonathan suspected the Earth's own heat could outlast any freeze. What did he uncover 40 steps beneath the surface? Subscribe to witness the astonishing truth. This is the story of Jonathan Decker, a homesteader who arrived in that frozen valley in 1876 with nothing but a wagon, a pregnant wife, and a dangerous idea. The valley's winters came so hard that the ground froze solid 6 feet deep by December, shattering root cellars and turning stored food into blocks of ice. A man could lose his entire harvest to a single frost before Christmas. But where others saw only killing cold, Jonathan studied the ancient rockslide at the edge of his claim and noticed something strange, a faint whisper of warm air rising through the broken stones. Could dig deep enough, he believed the Earth's own heat would shelter his family from the deadliest winter on record. What he uncovered 40 steps down would change everything. Jonathan Decker was not the first man to try farming that valley. A decade earlier, a group of German families had built cabins along the creek, certain that the sheltered hollows would soften winter's blow. They were wrong. The frost arrived in October that year and never left until May. The ground split open around their footings. Their root cellars collapsed into frozen rubble. By spring, 3 of their children were buried on the hillside. The survivors left their plows in the fields and never returned. When Jonathan arrived in 1876, the abandoned cabins still stood, their roofs sagging under old snow weight, their doors swinging open like warnings. He saw them and stayed anyway. The valley had something no other claim offered: stone. Not loose cobbles, but a massive, ancient rockslide spilling down from the ridge above his parcel. A jumbled cathedral of granite blocks the size of wagons. The slide had happened long before any living memory, maybe centuries earlier, when half the ridge face had sheared away and collapsed into a frozen cascade of stone. Now it stood at the edge of Jonathan's land like a ruin from another world. That first winter nearly killed them. The baby was only 4 months old when the thermometer dropped to 40 below. Emma, Jonathan's wife, wrapped the infant in every blanket they owned and still woke each morning to find frost inside the crib. The cabin walls groaned. The fireplace ate wood faster than Jonathan could split it. By February, he had burned half his furniture just to keep the temperature above freezing. They survived, barely. And when the thaw finally came in late April, Jonathan walked out to the rockslide and began to think. He had noticed it during the coldest nights. While everything else in the valley lay locked under ice, the base of that ancient rock pile stayed strangely bare. Snow collected around it but never directly against the lowest stones. On still mornings, he could see his breath in the air by the cabin, but near the slide, something different happened. A faint shimmer, a trembling of the air, as if the earth itself was exhaling. He pressed his hand against a granite face once at dawn and felt it. Not warmth exactly, but less cold, a difference so slight that only a man desperate for hope would notice it at all. That spring, he began to dig. Emma thought he was clearing a root cellar at first. A sensible project. Every homesteader needed underground storage for potatoes and beets, somewhere below the frost line where vegetables could survive the winter. She watched from the cabin door as Jonathan hauled stone after stone from the base of the slide, his shoulders already raw from the plowing he still hadn't finished. But the digging never stopped at cellar depth. It went deeper, and instead of moving outward into the soil, it moved inward, into the slide itself. People noticed. The nearest neighbor was Cellar's Grange, a man who had lost half his livestock to the valley's winters and blamed no one but himself for staying. Cellar's had the kind of face that weather carved into permanence, deep lines around the eyes, a mouth that defaulted to disapproval. He rode over one afternoon while Jonathan stood waist-deep in his excavation, prying loose a slab of granite with a crowbar. Silas watched for nearly a minute without speaking, his horse stamping impatiently against the cold mud. "You're digging into the slide," he said finally. It was not a question. Jonathan didn't deny it. Silas dismounted and walked closer, peering into the dark mouth of the excavation. The hole was wider now, wide enough for a man to disappear into, and the floor sloped downward at a steep angle between broken slabs. Even from the surface, the air coming out of that opening was different, warm enough to melt the frost on the stones around the entrance. "That ain't stable," Silas said. "Whole slide could settle on you in one night." Jonathan pulled another stone free and handed it up to his son, an 8-year-old boy named Caleb who had been stacking rocks into a growing wall beside the entrance. The boy took the stone without comment, his small hands already calloused from days of the same work. He had his father's quiet intensity and his mother's dark eyes, and he rarely spoke when grown men were talking. "She's carrying again," Jonathan said, nodding toward the cabin where Emma stood in the doorway. "Due before Christmas. I won't lose another one." He didn't explain what he meant by another one. He didn't have to. Everyone in the valley knew that the Deckers' first daughter had been born during the winter of '77 and had lived exactly 11 days. The cold had taken her so gently that Emma hadn't realized until morning, when the baby wouldn't wake to feed. They buried her in the frozen ground with a pickaxe and 2 hours of brutal labor, and Jonathan had never spoken her name again in daylight. Silas looked at the hole, then at the cabin, then at the gray sky pressing down over the valley. He had seen winters kill stronger men than Jonathan Decker. He had seen colder valleys break entire families, but he had never seen a man dig a staircase into a collapsed mountain. Finally, he shook his head and climbed back onto his horse. "You keep going much deeper, you'll hit cave country," he said. "This whole ridge sits on limestone. Could be nothing down there, could be a big hollow. Either way, a slide don't forgive mistakes." Jonathan didn't answer. He just kept prying at the stone while Silas rode away. What Silas had said about the limestone was true. The valley sat atop an ancient seabed, layers of sedimentary rock riddled with natural cavities carved by underground streams over millions of years. In some places, the earth was honeycombed with caves, dark, cold voids that swallowed whole creeks and returned nothing. The old German settlers had once lost a plow horse when it stepped through a thin crust of soil and vanished into a hidden sinkhole. They never found the body. The hole went that deep. Jonathan knew about the caves. That was precisely why he had chosen to dig where he did. Because a hollow space underground could hold something precious. Not water, not minerals, but air. Geothermal air, warmed by the Earth's deep heat and pushed upward through fissures and voids until it reached the surface. If he could tap into that current, if he could carve a chamber at the right depth where the rising warmth collected naturally, then his family would have something no other homestead in the valley possessed. A cellar the frost could never follow. The idea wasn't entirely his own. Years earlier, before coming west, Jonathan had worked as a laborer in the lead mines of southwestern Wisconsin. He had been 18 years old, skinny and green, lowered into wet shafts where the temperature never changed regardless of what happened on the surface. In winter, the miners stripped off their coats once they got 40 feet down because the Earth's own warmth kept the tunnels at a steady 50 degrees, season after season, year after year. That fact had lodged in his mind like a burr. If the Earth could keep a mine warm, it could keep a root cellar warm, if he dug deep enough. Now 2 years into his life in the valley, that old memory had become an obsession. He spent his days inside the slide, working downward stone by stone. The excavation narrowed into a stairway of rough-cut steps, each one chiseled from the granite itself or fitted from slabs he mortared into place with creek clay. He reinforced the walls with heavy timbers hauled from the ridge timberline, notched and braced like mine shaft supports. The work was backbreaking, dangerous, and slow. Some days he managed only a single step. Other days, a large boulder would shift and force him to spend hours clearing rubble before he could continue. And always, the air grew warmer as he descended. By early October, 20 steps were complete. The temperature at the bottom was already 15 degrees above the surface. Jonathan could stand in that dark, narrow shaft and feel his hands stop aching from the cold above. Emma climbed down once, just once, and stood in the silent half-darkness with one hand pressed against the stone wall. She was 6 months pregnant then, her belly beginning to round beneath her wool dress. When she came back up, she looked at her husband with something between hope and terror. "It's warm down there," she said. Jonathan nodded. "Could be nothing," she added, echoing Selah's. "Could be a hollow." "Then I'll fill it," Jonathan said, but his voice carried an edge of something harder. Not confidence, but refusal. He would not accept another winter like the first. He could not. The next day something changed. Jonathan had been working near the 22nd step, breaking apart a seam of shattered granite with a heavy hammer and chisel. Caleb was upstairs hauling buckets of loose stone to the surface. The boy had become strong over the summer, his arms wiry and brown from sun, his face serious beyond his years. He never complained about the work. He seemed to understand, even at 8, that his family's survival depended on what his father was doing. Suddenly, a deep crack echoed through the shaft. Jonathan stopped mid-swing. The sound had come from below, not the shifting of loose rock near the surface, but something deeper, a long, resonant fracture that seemed to travel through the stone like thunder. He pressed his ear against the wall and listened. For a long moment, nothing. Then he heard it, a low, steady rush, almost like breathing, the sound of air moving through a space much larger than any he had created. He drove the chisel deeper into the seam and struck once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th strike, a section of the wall collapsed inward with a roar that sent dust and fragments spraying across the shaft. Jonathan threw himself backward, shielding his face. When the debris settled, he looked up and saw something that stopped his heart. There was a cavity on the other side of the wall. Not a small fissure, but a genuine void, a dark chamber that stretched away beyond the reach of his lantern light. And from that darkness poured a current of air so warm and steady that the dust in the shaft began swirling upward in visible spirals, dancing in the pale light like spirits. Jonathan stood frozen at the threshold, one hand braced against the broken stone. He could hear Caleb calling down from above, his voice high with alarm. "Pa! Pa, what happened? Are you all right?" Jonathan didn't answer. He was staring into the black mouth of the cave, feeling the heat wash over his face, and realizing with a mixture of awe and dread that the valley had just revealed its oldest secret. But the mountain had not finished speaking. Somewhere far above, near the surface, the same fracture that had opened the cave wall had also disturbed something else, a key boulder deep in the heart of the slide. Jonathan heard it before he saw it. A grinding noise, the unmistakable sound of granite shifting against granite as the entire slope above him began to settle. He grabbed his lantern and scrambled for the stairs, shouting Caleb's name. The shaft around him shuddered. Dust and pebbles rained from the ceiling beams. And 30 feet above, at the surface, Emma stood in the cabin doorway with her hands pressed against her belly, watching the rock slide move for the first time in centuries. The grinding lasted only a few seconds, but the fear lasted much longer. Jonathan burst from the shaft mouth, dragging Caleb by the arm, his boots skidding on loose gravel as the entire mountainside groaned behind him. Emma was running toward them, her pregnancy forgotten in the terror of the moment, and then all 3 of them stood together in the pale autumn light, watching the ancient slide settle back into silence. A few small rocks tumbled down the slope. Dust rose in a thin cloud. And then everything stopped. Nothing had collapsed. The entrance to the shaft was still intact, its heavy timber braces unbroken. But Jonathan knew with the cold clarity of a man who had just felt the earth shift beneath his feet that something fundamental had changed. The cavity he had punched through was not just a small pocket. The way the air moved through it, the way the sound traveled, told him that the void was large, and that the slide above it was now balanced differently than it had been for centuries. He waited until after midnight, when Emma and Caleb were finally asleep, before going back down. This time he carried 2 lanterns and a coil of rope, and he moved with the deliberate care of a man entering a place that might not let him leave. The staircase was still solid. The timbers had held. At the 22nd step, he paused and looked at the hole he had made. Beyond it, the darkness seemed to breathe. He stepped through. The chamber on the other side was roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that sloped upward into shadow beyond the reach of his lantern. The walls were pale limestone, rippled and scalloped by water that had not flowed here in 1,000 years. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone icicles, their tips wet with slow condensation. The floor was remarkably flat, covered in a fine tan silt that had settled from ancient floods. And the air was alive. Not just warm, but moving, a steady current rising from somewhere deeper in the mountain and flowing upward into the shaft like breath from a sleeping giant. Jonathan stood in the center of that chamber and felt the cold leave his bones for the first time in 2 years. He had been right. Not lucky, not foolish, right. He explored the chamber carefully, marking its boundaries with chalk. At the far end, a narrow fissure continued downward into blackness, the source of the warm air. He dropped a stone into it and listened. The silence stretched impossibly long before a distant splash echoed back. Water, deep down. And the air that rose from it carried the steady temperature of the Earth's core, exactly as the mine shafts in Wisconsin had taught him to expect. But the discovery came with a warning. As he swept the lantern across the ceiling, he noticed fresh cracks in the limestone, fractures that had not been there before the slide shifted. The same stress that had opened the cavity wall had also weakened the roof. One well-placed frost heave, one heavy snow load on the surface, and the entire ceiling could come down. Jonathan returned to the surface with his chalk-marked notes and his lantern smoking low, and he did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table while Emma slept, sketching plans by candlelight, calculating timber loads and arch supports, designing a cellar that would not just shelter his family but survive the mountain that contained it. The work that followed was the hardest of his life. Every step of the staircase had to be reinforced with cross-braced timbers, notched and wedged into the stone. The chamber itself needed a support frame, a heavy lattice of pine beams shaped to bear the ceiling's weight while allowing the warm air to circulate freely. He built shelves from split planks, mortared a floor over the silt, and constructed a heavy door at the bottom of the stairs to seal the warmth inside. 40 steps from surface to chamber floor, every one of them dug, carved, or carried by hand. Caleb worked beside him through it all, the boy's small hands learning to swing a hammer and set a brace as naturally as other children learned to skip stones. Emma, her belly growing larger with each passing week, carried food and water to the shaft mouth, watching her husband disappear into the earth morning after morning and reappear exhausted, but driven by a fire she had not seen since the night they buried their daughter. By the first week of November, the work was largely complete. The staircase descended 40 steps through reinforced timbers into a chamber that held a steady temperature of 52 degrees, regardless of what happened on the surface. The shelves were stocked with potatoes, beets, carrots, jars of preserved meat, sacks of flour. A small iron stove stood in the corner, vented through a narrow chimney drilled up through the limestone. In an emergency, the family could live down there for weeks, maybe months. Sela's Grange didn't wait for an invitation. On a cold afternoon with snow already flurrying in the passes, he rode up to the Decker claim with 3 other men from the valley, a blacksmith named Coster, a trapper called Mortensen, and a Welsh miner named Perry who had worked the copper veins in Michigan before coming west. They stood at the top of the shaft and stared down into the darkness while Jonathan held a lantern at his side and waited. Perry spoke first. He had a miner's squint and a miner's respect for underground things. "You shored it with pine. That'll rot in 3 years. "I'll replace it then," Jonathan said. Perry climbed down slowly, running his hands along the timber braces, checking the joints with the practiced eye of a man who had survived cave-ins. The others followed, ducking through the low entrance into the warm chamber. The temperature change hit them immediately, a wash of heat that made their heavy coats suddenly unnecessary. Coster, the blacksmith, stood in the center of the room and let out a low whistle. "Ain't felt air like this since September," he said. "How deep are we?" 40 feet to the floor," Jonathan said. "But the heat comes from deeper, warm springs somewhere below. The mountain's been heating this rock for 10,000 years. Mortensen, the trapper, was less impressed. He had spent countless winters in the high country and trusted nothing that came easily. "This ceiling looks stable to you?" he asked, pointing at the cracks Jonathan had noticed weeks earlier. Whole thing could come down with one hard freeze. And there it was, the same doubt that had followed Jonathan since the day he first lifted a pry bar into the slide. He had answers, solid ones, about arch support and load distribution, about the way the timber frame transferred weight to the walls. But none of that changed the fundamental truth Mortensen had named. The mountain was fractured, and Jonathan had built his cellar inside the fracture. The men climbed back to the surface in silence. Silas was the last to leave. He paused at the top of the shaft and looked back at Jonathan with an expression that was no longer mocking, but something closer to concern. "You know what the old Germans said about this valley," he said quietly. "They said it holds heat in the summer and cold in the winter, and the ground never really settles. That's why they left." "Their cabins are still standing," Jonathan said. "For now," Silas replied. Then he mounted his horse and rode away through the first thin flakes of snow. 3 nights later, the temperature plummeted to 17 below. Jonathan woke to the sound of the cabin walls cracking in the cold, the sharp report of contracting wood like gunshots in the darkness. Emma was already awake, her hands resting on her stomach, her face tight with the discomfort that had become constant in her 8th month. The baby was due in 6 weeks, maybe less. If the cold held, she would give birth in the deepest heart of winter with no doctor within a day's ride. Jonathan built up the fire and checked the thermometer outside the window. The glass read 20 below, and it was still dropping. He thought about the cellar, about the 52-degree air waiting 40 steps down, about the small iron stove that could warm the chamber to 60 if needed. And for the first time, he understood that the cellar was no longer just for storage. It might become the only place his family could survive what was coming. He told Emma to dress warmly and wake Caleb. They would move into the cellar before the cold got worse. Emma did not argue. She had felt the change in the weather the way animals feel it, a deep primal pressure in the air that warned of danger beyond the ordinary winter harshness. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, helped Caleb into his heavy coat, and followed her husband through the darkness toward the mouth of the shaft. The descent was slow. The stairs were slick with frost near the surface, and Jonathan carried the lantern ahead of them, testing each step before he allowed Emma to put weight on it. Caleb clutched his mother's hand, his breath streaming white in the frozen air. But as they moved deeper, something remarkable happened. The ice on the steps disappeared. The walls began to feel warmer to the touch. And by the time they reached the chamber door, the temperature was 45 degrees and climbing. Jonathan pushed open the heavy wooden door and ushered his family inside. The chamber was dark except for the lantern, but the stove grate still held coals from an earlier firing. He added kindling and watched the flames catch, throwing warm orange light across the limestone walls. Emma sank onto a makeshift cot he had built near the stove, and Caleb curled beside her, already half asleep, lulled by the warmth. Jonathan stood near the chimney vent, listening. The storm above was howling now, the wind screaming through the valley with a violence that even the cabin had never fully sheltered them from. But here, 40 feet underground, the sound was distant and harmless. The mountain absorbed everything. For 3 hours they were safe. Emma's discomfort eased in the warmth. Caleb slept deeply for the first time in days. And Jonathan, still too vigilant to rest, walked the perimeter of the chamber, checking the timber braces, listening to the cave breathe, watching the tiny fractures in the ceiling for any sign of movement. The change came without warning. A deep, resonant crack from somewhere above, followed by a rumble that vibrated through the stone floor. Emma sat up instantly, her hand flying to her belly. "Jonathan," she whispered. The rumble grew. Dust sifted from the ceiling fractures. Then the sound of falling rock, huge rocks, crashing down the staircase outside the chamber door. Jonathan threw himself across the room and slammed the heavy timber door shut just as a cascade of stone thundered past on the other side. The ground shook. The lantern flickered. And when the silence finally returned, thick and oppressive, Jonathan tried to push the door open and found it wouldn't move. The staircase beyond it had collapsed entirely, buried under tons of granite and frozen earth. They were sealed inside the mountain with a pregnant woman, an 8-year-old boy, and no way back to the surface. They were sealed inside the mountain with a pregnant woman, an 8-year-old boy, and no way back to the surface. For a long moment, nobody moved. Dust still hung in the lantern light, drifting through the warm air like fine snow. Jonathan stood with both hands pressed against the door, feeling the resistance of the stone piled behind it. The timber frame had cracked in 3 places, but the door itself held. What it held against was the weight of an entire staircase, a throat of broken granite and frozen earth that had collapsed from the surface down. He listened at the wood and heard nothing. No shifting, no settling, just the deep, absolute silence of a mountain that had already fallen. He turned. Emma was still on the cot, her face pale but controlled. She had one hand pressed low against her belly and the other resting on Caleb's shoulder. The boy was awake now, his eyes huge in the dim light. "Is it going to come down on us, Pa?" Caleb asked. He meant the ceiling, the cracks that everyone had warned them about. Jonathan did not lie to his son. "Not if the timbers hold," he said, "and I built them to hold." He checked each brace, one by one, running his hands along the joints, feeling for fractures in the wood. The main arch supports over the center of the chamber had taken the shock without breaking. The ceiling cracks had widened slightly. He could fit his thumbnail into fissures that before had barely been visible, but the limestone remained interlocked, its weight still distributed across the frame. The mountain had settled, and for now it had stopped. But the staircase was gone. That was the terrifying math. He had built the cellar with only one entrance, assuming the slide was stable enough that a single shaft would never collapse completely. That assumption was now buried under something like 15 tons of stone. Worse, nobody on the surface knew for certain that they were trapped. Silas and the others had visited days earlier, but after that, no one. The storm above would blanket the valley in snow, erasing tracks. If the shaft mouth was buried, a rescue party might not even know where to dig. And even if they did, clearing 40 feet of collapsed rubble by hand in the dead of winter was a task that could take weeks. Weeks they might not have. The first hour was the hardest. Emma's calm began to fray as the reality of their position settled over her. She asked Jonathan if the air would run out. He showed her the chimney vent, where a thin current of warmth still rose from the deeper fissure, rippling the flame of a candle he held to the opening. The cave was breathing. As long as the deep fissure remained open, they had oxygen. The temperature stayed steady at 52 degrees. The stove, if he fed it sparingly, could keep the chamber warm for days on the small store of wood he had stockpiled. But the fissure itself nagged at him. He had dropped a stone into it weeks earlier and heard a splash, deep and distant. The warm air that rose from it carried no smell of sulfur or rot, only the clean mineral scent of deep limestone. It was possible, he realized, that the fissure wasn't just a crack, it was a passage. A route into the larger cave system that Silas had warned him about, the honeycomb of voids that riddled the ridge. If that system connected to the surface somewhere else, it might be their only way out. The thought was barely formed when a sound reached them from above. Not a rock fall. A rhythmic, metallic ringing, faint but unmistakable. Someone on the surface was pounding on stone. It might have been a sledgehammer. It might have been a pick. The sound traveled through the mountain in dull waves, each impact a vibration in the walls. Emma sat up. Caleb scrambled to his feet. Jonathan held his breath and listened. The pounding continued for several minutes, then stopped. Silence. Then it began again, closer this time, or maybe just louder. Someone was digging toward them from the surface. Silas, perhaps, or Perry and Coster. Or all of them together, working through the storm because they had seen the collapse and chosen not to wait. The sound was the most hopeful thing Jonathan had ever heard, and it was also the most dangerous, because every blow against the fallen stone was sending shockwaves through the ceiling cracks above their heads. He shouted up toward the buried staircase, his voice muffled by the rubble. He had no idea if they could hear him, but he called out anyway. "We're alive. We're in the chamber." The pounding stopped for a moment, then resumed with greater urgency. They had heard him, or at least they had heard something. The rescue was underway. It was only later, when the pounding had continued for hours without seeming to make much progress, that Jonathan began to understand how bad their situation truly was. The shaft had been narrow, barely wide enough for a man to climb. The collapse had filled it completely, and every time the rescuers pulled away a chunk of stone, more rubble slid down to replace it. The mountain was fighting them. After 6 hours, the sound had advanced maybe 3 vertical feet. At that rate, it would take more than a week to reach the chamber. And Emma could not wait a week. She didn't say it, but he could see it in the way she moved. Her breathing had become more deliberate, her pauses longer. The baby was low, and the stress of the collapse had accelerated something. She wasn't in labor yet, but she was close. Too close for a week of waiting. Jonathan made his decision sometime after midnight, while Emma slept fitfully on the cot and Caleb curled beside her. He lit a second lantern, checked the rope coil over his shoulder, and walked to the back of the chamber where the fissure opened into darkness. The narrow crack descended at a sharp angle, barely wide enough for his shoulders. But the air that rose from it was warm and steady, and somewhere far below, water was moving. Where there was water and air, there might be a way out. He tied one end of the rope to a timber brace and fed the other end down the fissure. Then he began to descend. The passage was tighter than anything he had ever crawled through. The limestone walls pressed against his chest and back, slick with condensation that had been condensing there for millennia. His lantern threw wild shadows as he inched downward, the rope burning against his gloves. 10 feet. 15. The fissure widened slightly, then dropped into a vertical chimney. He braced his boots against opposite walls and lowered himself hand over hand until his feet touched solid ground again. He was in a chamber much larger than the one above. The lantern light barely reached the opposite wall, maybe 40 feet away. Stalactites hung in dense clusters from a ceiling that arched 30 feet overhead. The floor was smooth limestone, polished by ancient water, and at the center of the chamber lay a pool of clear, steaming water that reflected the lantern flame like a mirror. The warmth here was palpable, not just comfortable but genuinely warm, maybe 65 degrees, heated by the geothermal current that had carved this place. And at the far end of the chamber, a breeze. A distinct, directional movement of air that smelled faintly of pine and snow. It was coming from a passage on the north wall, a low tunnel that sloped upward into darkness. Natural air exchange. If the breeze was coming from the surface, that tunnel connected to the outside world. Jonathan stood beside the warm pool, feeling the breeze on his face, and allowed himself to believe that they might actually survive. But the tunnel was narrow, and Emma could barely walk on level ground at this point. If the passage required crawling or climbing, she would never make it. And leaving Caleb alone with her while he went for help wasn't an option either, not with the ceiling above them still unstable, not with labor imminent. He climbed back up the fissure with the news, his arms shaking from exhaustion. Emma listened without speaking, and when he finished, she asked only one question. "How far is it?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can feel outside air. That means it's open." The pounding from above had stopped. The silence was worse than the noise had been. Jonathan tried calling up again, but no response came. Maybe the rescuers had retreated for the night. Maybe the storm had intensified and driven them back. Maybe they had simply run out of hope. He had no way of knowing. Caleb, who had been quiet for hours, finally spoke. "I can fit through the tunnel, Pa. I can go get help." Jonathan looked at his 8-year-old son, the boy who had carried stones all summer, who had learned to swing a hammer and set a brace, who had never once complained about the brutal work of building this cellar. He was skinny enough to crawl through almost any passage. He was brave enough to try, but sending an 8-year-old into an unexplored cave system in the middle of a blizzard was not a plan. It was a desperation move that might cost Jonathan his only son. He told Caleb no. Not yet. That night the mountain groaned again, a deep, resonant vibration that shook dust from the ceiling and sent fresh cracks spidering across the limestone. The chimney vent began to whistle as air pressure changed. Emma sat upright on the cot, her face suddenly sharp with pain, and she cried out once, a short, involuntary sound that she tried to swallow but couldn't. The contraction passed after 30 seconds, and she looked at Jonathan with an expression that was no longer controlled. It was afraid. "Jonathan," she whispered, "it's starting." The baby was coming. 40 feet underground, sealed inside a fractured mountain with no midwife, no doctor, and no certain way back to the surface. And outside, the storm was burying the valley under 3 feet of fresh snow while the rescuers above tried desperately to dig through a collapsed staircase that refused to stay cleared. Jonathan had one chance left: the fissure, the warm pool chamber, the breeze from the north tunnel. He didn't know where it led or how far, or whether it would open onto the valley floor or into a frozen drift. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: the Earth's own heat had carved this place. The same geothermal current that kept the chamber warm had been flowing through this mountain for 10,000 years, following the path of least resistance toward the surface. If he could follow that current upward, it would lead to air. And if it led to air, it led to life. The decision came to Jonathan in the dark, while Emma's breathing grew shallow and the baby's first true contraction had already passed. He could wait for the rescuers to dig through 40 feet of collapsed stone, or he could trust the warm current that had been rising through this mountain for 10,000 years. The earth had given them a cellar the frost could never touch. Now he had to believe it would give them a way out. He told Emma he would be gone no more than an hour. If the north tunnel connected to the surface, he would come back with help. If it didn't, he would return and they would find another way. Caleb understood what his father was asking without being told. He was to stay with his mother, keep the stove burning, and listen at the door for any sound from above. The boy nodded once, his small jaw set in the same hard line Jonathan recognized from the mirror. The descent through the fissure was faster the second time. Jonathan's body remembered the holds, the narrow squeeze, the spot where the limestone opened into the larger chamber. He dropped onto the smooth floor and crossed to the warm pool, where steam still rose in lazy spirals. The north tunnel lay beyond it, a low mouth of darkness that exhaled pine and snow. He crawled inside. The passage was tight for the first 30 feet, forcing him onto his belly with his lantern held ahead in one hand. The walls were wet, polished by ancient water, and the temperature shifted subtly as he climbed, still warm at his back but cooler against his face. That meant he was moving toward the surface. The third thing he noticed was the sound, not the deep silence of the chamber behind him, but a distant, rhythmic rushing that grew louder with every foot of progress. Wind. The surface wind, funneling through an opening somewhere ahead. After 50 feet, the tunnel widened enough for him to crouch. After 100, he could stand. The floor sloped sharply upward, and the ceiling rose into darkness beyond his lantern's reach. He was climbing through a chimney carved by water that had not flowed here since the last ice age. The walls were encrusted with delicate crystals that caught the light and threw it back in fragments. And at the top of the slope, a pale gray glow appeared, not daylight, but something close enough to stop his heart. He scrambled toward it and emerged behind a frozen waterfall at the base of the ridge, the ice cascading down a 30-foot cliff face like a curtain of white glass. Beyond the ice, the blizzard still howled, but here, in the sheltered hollow between the waterfall and the rock, the air was still. He could see the valley floor through gaps in the ice. The collapsed shaft was 200 yards to the east. He could see lantern light bobbing there, small figures hunched against the snow, still digging. Silas had not given up. Perry had not given up. They had worked through the night and they were barely 10 feet down. Jonathan pushed through a gap in the ice and stumbled into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he was already shouting, waving his lantern above his head. Silas saw him first. The old man straightened from the excavation and stared as if witnessing a resurrection. Perry dropped his shovel. They had been digging toward a buried chamber they could no longer hear, and now the man they were trying to reach was walking toward them from entirely the wrong direction. "You found another way out," Silas said. "It was not a question." "The warm air put me out behind the waterfall," Jonathan said, his voice raw. "There's a whole cave system below us, a big one with a warm pool and a passage to the surface. Emma's still down there. The baby's coming." His words cut through their exhaustion. Perry was already reaching for the coil of rope beside the excavation. The miner's eyes had sharpened. He understood caves. He understood what a warm pool meant, what a passage system meant, and what had to happen next. "We can bring her out through the fissure," Perry said, "but it's tight. She's 8 months along. We'll need to widen the narrowest section." "How long?" Perry looked at the frozen waterfall, then at the storm still screaming across the valley. "If the limestone's soft enough, 2 hours." maybe 3. Jonathan didn't have 3 hours. Neither did Emma. The work began immediately. Silas and Coster, who had joined the rescue after dawn, hauled tools around the ridge while Perry led Jonathan back through the tunnel from the waterfall's side. This entrance was wider, less choked, and the climb down into the warm chamber took only 10 minutes from the surface. When they reached the fissure that connected the lower chamber to the cellar, Perry studied the narrow throat with a miner's practiced eye. The limestone was fractured there, weakened by the same stress that had opened the cavity in the first place. With a sledgehammer and cold chisel, a man could open it another foot in an hour. But that meant hammering directly beneath the unstable ceiling of the upper chamber, where Emma lay in labor. Jonathan made the call. He climbed back up the fissure to the cellar and found Emma awake, her face sheened with sweat, one hand gripping the edge of the cot while another contraction rippled through her. Caleb was beside her, his small hand wrapped around hers, his face pale but steady. The boy had kept the fire going. He had done everything his father had asked. "They found a way," Jonathan told her. "Perry's widening the fissure from below. We're going to get you out." Emma's eyes, clouded with pain, found his. "The baby's not waiting, Jonathan," he knew. The contractions were coming faster now, 3 minutes apart, each one longer than the last. For the next hour, Jonathan split his attention between Emma and the sounds echoing up from the fissure. Perry's hammer blows rang through the stone, each one a vibration in the walls, each one a risk. The ceiling cracks widened slightly, tiny fragments of limestone dusting down from above. But the timbers held. When Perry finally called up that the passage was wide enough, the transformation was barely sufficient. A grown man could squeeze through with his arms above his head. Emma, nearly 9 months pregnant, would have to be guided inch by inch through the narrowest section, and she would have to do it between contractions. It was dangerous, it was slow, and it was their only chance. Jonathan wrapped her in every blanket they had and tied a rope sling beneath her arms. Caleb went first, slipping through the fissure easily, his small body already familiar with the passage from his father's descriptions. Then Jonathan lowered himself into the gap, bracing his back against one wall and his feet against the other, so he could guide Emma from below. She followed him into the darkness, her breath coming in sharp gasps that had nothing to do with the cold. The warm air rose around her like a second blanket, wrapping her in the earth's steady heat. The tightest section came 20 feet down, a pinch point where the limestone narrowed to a slot barely 18 inches wide. Perry, waiting below, had done what he could, but the rock here was harder and time had run out. Emma stopped, her belly pressed against the stone, and a contraction seized her in the worst possible moment. She cried out once, a raw sound that echoed through the cave like something ancient. Jonathan braced her from below, his hands on her shoulders, whispering words he could not later remember. The contraction passed. She exhaled. And then, with a final twisting movement that cost her the last of her strength, she was through. Jonathan caught her as she slid into the lower chamber, and together they sank onto the smooth limestone floor beside the warm pool. The water steamed gently in the lantern light. The air was 65 degrees and utterly still. Silas had climbed in from the waterfall entrance. He stood at the edge of the chamber holding a lantern and a bundle of clean cloth that Ruth Grange had sent. His wife had arrived at the rescue site an hour earlier, having ridden through the storm alone when she heard that Emma Decker was trapped underground and in labor. Ruth was 63 years old, a grandmother 7 times over, and she had delivered more Bobbies on the frontier than any doctor within 100 miles. Now she was lowering herself through the waterfall tunnel with a bag of supplies and an expression that allowed no argument. The baby was born 40 minutes later, in the warm chamber beneath the mountain, with the sound of the storm muffled to a distant whisper and the pool's steam rising around them like a blessing. A daughter. Ruth placed the squalling infant on Emma's chest while Jonathan knelt beside them, his hands still black with limestone dust, his eyes streaming. Caleb sat cross-legged at his father's side, watching his new sister with the same intense focus he had once given to cedar saplings and hammer strikes. The child was healthy, loud, and warm. The earth had heated the chamber so evenly that Ruth, who had delivered children in drafty cabins and frozen wagons, kept shaking her head in quiet awe. "I've never seen a birthing room like this," she said. "Never." It took another full day before the storm passed and the valley emerged into pale winter sunlight. By then, the rescue party had widened the waterfall entrance enough to bring Emma and the baby out on a litter. The entire homestead community had gathered at the Decker claim, having heard the news through the frozen trails. They watched in silence as Jonathan emerged from the ice-curtained cleft carrying his newborn daughter, wrapped in wool and still radiating warmth from the cave below. Emma followed on the litter, exhausted but alive, her hand clasped around Caleb's. The staircase was gone. The entrance Jonathan had spent months carving into the slide was buried under tons of rubble that would never be cleared. But the cellar they had built together, the chamber 40 steps down, the warm pool, the natural passages that connected to the surface, remained intact and accessible through the waterfall entrance. The frost could never follow because the frost had never been strong enough to reach that deep. The Earth's own furnace, the geothermal current rising through the ancient limestone, had been protecting this valley since long before any human ever dug a foundation. All Jonathan had done was listen to what it was trying to tell him. In the weeks that followed, as Emma recovered and the new baby grew fat on her mother's milk, the homesteaders of the valley began to understand the full scope of what Jonathan Decker had discovered. Perry, the miner, mapped the cave system and found 4 additional chambers, all of them warm, all of them stable, all of them connected by the same geothermal current that had carved the original pool chamber. The honeycomb of voids that Cellar had warned about was not a danger. It was the valley's oldest secret, an underground network of natural shelters that held a constant temperature regardless of the surface weather. The rockslide had merely been the door Jonathan used to find it. Cellar's Grange, who had once told Jonathan he was teaching the storm where to bury his family, became the first homesteader to ask for help building his own veil ring around his cabin. Name, borrowed from Parker Vale's famous snow filter, had migrated west with the frontier stories, and Cellar applied it now to a new purpose. With Jonathan's help, he constructed a cold sink cellar of his own, a shallow basement that used the same thermal principles. Not every homestead could dig 40 feet into limestone, but every homestead could learn to use the Earth's steady temperature to protect what mattered. And the Decker cellar, the original one, became something more than a storage room. For the next 30 years, it served as a winter refuge for any family caught in the valley when the blizzards came. The warm pool never cooled. The air never turned foul. The daughter born there, whom they named Eve in honor of the garden that had bloomed underground on the night she arrived, grew up playing in the chambers her father had discovered. She learned to read snow the way he had, to feel the earth's temperature with her bare hands, and to understand that the most dangerous thing in winter was not the cold itself, but the failure to respect the forces that created it. Jonathan Decker never built another staircase. He didn't need to. The one he had carved through the heart of that ancient rockslide had already taught him everything that mattered. The mountain had not been an obstacle. It had been a doorway. And on the far side of that doorway, 40 steps down where the frost could never follow, the earth had been waiting the whole time to protect his family. The cellar still exists today. Hidden beneath the ancient rockslide, its warm air rises as steadily as it did on the night Eve Decker was born. The staircase Jonathan carved is gone, sealed by the mountain's own settling, but the waterfall entrance remains, and on the coldest days of a Dakota winter, steam still curls from behind the ice like a promise the earth has never broken. The valley never forgot what he found, and the families that came after learned to dig their own cellars not as deep, but with the same reverence for the invisible heat that moves through the ground. There is a photograph taken in 1912 that shows 3 generations of Deckers standing before that frozen cascade. Jonathan is old by then, his beard white, his back bent from decades of stone work, but his eyes hold the same focus they did when he first pressed his palm against the warm granite. Emma stands beside him, her hand resting on Eve's shoulder, and Eve herself now holds an infant of her own. Caleb, grown into a man who never left the valley, stands to the side with a pickaxe balanced on one shoulder. They are not smiling at the camera. They are looking at the mountain, and the mountain in that pale winter light looks back. What Jonathan Decker did was not a miracle. It was attention. While others saw the rock slide as a threat, he saw it as a door. While others fought the frost with thicker walls and larger fires, he climbed down 40 steps and let the earth do what it had always done. The warm current that saved his family had been flowing through that limestone for 10,000 years. He simply refused to ignore it. That decision, more than any tool or technique, is what made the difference between a man who survived a terrible winter and a man who built a sanctuary beneath one. And yet, the question remains, was he brilliant, or was he simply one of the few willing to listen when winter spoke? Because the mountain had been teaching that lesson to anyone who would kneel in the frozen grass and pay attention. The old German families who fled had felt the same instability, but they interpreted it as danger and left. Jonathan felt the heat and stayed. He trusted the earth not to crush him, and in return, the earth gave him a cellar the frost could never follow, a birthing room warmer than any cabin, and a legacy that would outlast the storms that tested it. The frontier was full of men like Jonathan Decker. Not famous, not wealthy, not remembered in history books, but carrying within them a stubborn willingness to believe that nature, however violent, could be read rather than conquered. And sometimes, if you read carefully enough, the thing that might have buried you becomes the thing that builds your shelter instead. If this story stays with you, subscribe and watch our next documentary about a lighthouse keeper who turned a shipwreck into a home. Sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about listening to the forces that were already there.